all religious beliefs are byproducts of mechanisms originally designed for other purposes.
Andy, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you.
For being on my podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you. I have your book. Thank you for sending that to me. I think it is.
Thank you for having the book.
Yeah, no, of course. I think it is absolutely fascinating how much information you have packed into a book. This is deceptive. The size is deceptive. I don't know if you can see all my notes that I've got going, but first of all, I guess I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and what you're going to be talking about today.
I'm a psychiatrist. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia. I am at the University of Virginia Student Health Services, Counseling and Psychological Services. I worked there probably 20 to 30 hours a week.
Wow.
Before that, I was half-time at Student Health and had a half-time private and forensic practice. And I'm in the I'm resisting retirement, but I closed down my private practice and forensic practice, and I still now just work at Student Health Services and just an adult general psychiatrist, and got interested for a variety of reasons in religion and what leads to religious belief, and wrote the little book you've got.
Yeah. And what was it? Do you remember exactly the moment or kind of the time in your life where your interest went from just psychiatry to specifically focusing on religion in psychiatry?
Well, it's a little bit more circuitous than that, in that in the 1990s, I think the late 1990s, a lawyer friend of mine, Willis Spalding, gave me a copy of Robert Wright's book, The Moral Animal. And Robert Wright did a book that described in, I think, beautiful detail the discipline of evolutionary psychology, which had really started to take off in the early 90s. And he gave me a copy of, I think he gave me a copy of the book, and I read the book and I was transformed. I think it's the best yet that we have in terms of a fundamental understanding of human nature and psychology and psychiatry. So I was already predisposed towards evolutionary psychology, the idea of adaptions in the brain, byproducts, adaptions, the evolutionary psychology thinking. And then on 9/11, my son was in the Merrill building, which was right next to one of the Twin Towers. And so he came perilously close, I think, to being injured or killed, and witnessed the whole thing. And I was obviously, my wife and I and he and the family were quite shaken by it all.
Yeah.
And I started to research suicide terrorism. My way of dealing with it was to start to research suicide terrorism, religiously based suicide terrorism. And I literally stumbled into all this work that had been done on the psychology of religion, the cognitive neuroscience of religion, why we believe, the things that make us vulnerable to believe. And I was just astounded that all this work was out there, much of it evolutionarily based. And Pascal Boyer's books, for instance, Religion Explained. There are a lot of wonderful books out there. And it upset me that this was not more widely known.
Right.
And so I, first of all, I put together a talk on suicide terrorism and sort of synthesized other people's work and created what I called sort of a three-factor theory of suicide terrorism. Male bonded coalitionary violence is part of males. We all have adaptations for suicide. One particular adaptation called bargaining, which was developed by Edward Hagen, I think characterizes one of the dynamics of suicide terrorism, particularly in the men. A man named Dennis D. Catanzaro developed an idea of the burdensomeness model of suicidality, and I think that tends to characterize the dynamics of the women suicide terrorists. So you have male bonded coalitionary violence, our vulnerability to commit suicide, and then you have religious beliefs, which I think are very effective at hijacking male bonded coalitionary violence and very effective at hijacking our capacities for suicide. So I think when those three things come together, you have the recipe for suicide terrorism. Obviously, one of those prongs, the third prong, was the cognitive psychology, the cognitive neuroscience of religious belief. And my first talks were suicide terrorism, but then I developed a second talk on why we believe in gods, and it became popular. I was particularly appreciative. American Atheists gave me an opportunity to present it at their meeting in Atlanta, I think it was 2009, and a very good film of it was made that got, I think it's now 1.8 million views, something like that.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, no, it's very gratifying.
Right.
And that's unusual for a talk that's almost an hour.
Right.
And some people encouraged me to publish, and I had the thought that it would be good to have, there's so many people out there, I think, like me, in the sense that we're unaware that this stuff was out there. I mean, it's in books, it's in academic journals. And I thought, okay, was there a way that I could put it in a little book that would introduce people to it, would give them the basics, and show them that we are really quite close to a really comprehensive psychological science of religious belief. And so the idea was to create exactly what you saw, which was what you have is this little quick read, and it hopefully gets people informed. And I had the good fortune of, in the past, working with a medical editor, Claire Alcafer, and she really is a co-author of the book. And so we did the book and got a publisher. We're fortunate. Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword. Sam Harris,
which is so cool.
Sam Harris wrote a blurb for it, which is deeply gratifying.
Right.
And the book continues to sell, and this year somebody had the courage to do an Arabic translation. I had previously tried to get an Arabic. Yeah, I'd previously tried to get an Arabic translation, and people would agree to do it, but then they'd back out.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Understandably. Yeah. And a very courageous individual did the Urdu translation, and part of the agreement was that his identity remained secret.
Wow.
And it's been translated, I think, into Spanish, Italian, Polish, Turkish, Hebrew, Urdu, now Arabic. So it's been, deeply, I'm an unknown shrink in the provinces, and it's just been wonderful.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks a lot for the content, that somebody was willing to literally risk their lives in order to translate that information into their language. That's wild.
Oh, I mean, it's even more than that. There was a publisher in Lahore, Pakistan, that was willing to publish the book, and they got in trouble. The authorities briefly came after them, and we were terribly worried.
Yeah.
But you can actually, um, uh, if anybody would like it, I'll send them a hardback version of the Urdu. It's beautiful. I mean, the calligraphy is beautiful. And a friend of mine who's an Urdu speaker looked at it and said it's very well done. And the translator took liberty and made allusions to famous Urdu poetry and said it's very good. And it's free on the internet if anybody wants it.
Wow.
And
That's cool.
yeah, it is. No, it's just, but that publisher, both the translator and the publisher, I mean, it's just extraordinary courage, really,
It is.
and particularly that publisher. I mean, I still am astounded they were willing to do that.
Absolutely. And I know that you and I had spoken previous to this about the accessibility of this information and how even people like you and I who are out there looking for it, we want this information, we want to read these things.
Mhm.
It's so difficult to find them and to access them. And one of the things I liked the most about your book was that I feel like sometimes on the occasion that I do find content that I'm looking for example, like how the brain processes why we believe in God, things like that, it's written almost in a language only for academics. It's written for people who are, well, PhDs and have been involved in
Mhm.
the health and sciences for a long time. But what I liked about your book is it's written for everyone. It's
Yeah.
written in a way, a pace and a language that is very accessible for anyone. And I think that is also very important as well, because I feel like education is such a privilege to have, and not everybody has certain levels of education. And sometimes, even if they have the content in their hands, the language is what makes it inaccessible. But you wrote it very conversationally, and your examples are very clear and concise. And I really appreciated that too, because I feel like that goes hand in hand with the concern about the inaccessibility of this information.
Well, thank you. That's very gratifying to hear, and a shout out should go to Claire because she was instrumental in that, and we wanted it written in a way that it would be accessible. Because the other thing that is so, I think, powerful about this is that the basic mechanisms that generate religious belief are the everyday mechanisms all of us use. And so you don't need scientific language to describe it.
Right.
I mean, it helps sometimes, but you can get across the basic mechanisms in, you don't need to have a neuroscience education or and our hope obviously is that one day this will be required. I mean, you can't have a psychology 101 textbook freshman year of college and it pass muster unless it has this material in it.
Right.
I think that's really the next step, so that a a basic education is going to involve, and a basic education is going to involve, you have to take psychology 101, and in that textbook is going to be the psychology of religion, why we believe.
Right. And what do you think are the harms in keeping this information less public, harder to access? Like, what do you think that means for the safety of people mentally, emotionally, physically? Like, what are your concerns in terms of this information not being more accessible?
I think I think it delays the future that we all hope for, and I think we can all hope for ultimately a global civil society, and that we realize that we're it, and that we are our brothers and sisters keepers, and we are the keepers of this planet, and that the old superstitions of the past, the old supernatural beliefs, are gone.
Mhm.
That I think that's what we all hope for, and I think it's interesting that, as the number of non-believers slowly is climbing. I think that's good news.
Yes.
I would, of course, like to know what motivates them. I'm hoping people are doing sociologic studies to find out, why they're moving away from religion. And I think this knowledge would validate the people that are moving away, particularly the people who are moving away who are, it's a conflict within the family, and help buttress their conviction that there is no God, that this is it, that we're all in this together. And I think the longer, to get to your question, the longer it takes, the longer religion continues to do damage. I think Christopher Hitchens was absolutely right. Religion poisons everything.
Absolutely. And one of the things I find the most interesting about religion is that it touts, especially Christianity. I can't say that all religions do, but Christianity especially touts so much about free will. And yet, when it comes to accessing the information that might help you make the decision whether or not you want to be a Christian or whether or not you do believe in God, it's hidden, it's hard to get, it's hard to reach. And that's interesting to me. It's like, we have free will as long as you want to think the way that we're telling you to think, which in itself is dangerous. And I've told people in the past, if I were God, I would want you to know exactly why you believe in me. I would want you to have access to research, to have access to information, and to still decide that I'm the right choice. But that seems to be kind of the opposite of what is happening, especially in American, more conservative religions. And I think that's interesting.
And
Interesting.
I think it's evidence that they know it's not true.
Exactly.
Why would they be afraid of you looking at something unless they knew that it would it would sway you because it's true? I think at some level, some of these people know this. A young friend of mine is trying to break away from Jehovah's Witnesses, and he shared a videotape. It's on YouTube, and of somebody who's in his 30s, who's an elder who left Jehovah's Witnesses, and he describes with quite powerful how he really internalized that he should not look at anything that contradicts Jehovah's Witness. Those people were, I'm afraid I can't remember the word. They were either infidel. It's not infidel, but it was.
I know what you're talking about.
But that you don't look at these. You don't look at these people. You don't read what these people have to say. There's an injunction not to read it. The people are, and why would you be so scared of them looking at this stuff unless at some level you knew it might be true?
Right. And if your faith was truly faith, if you truly believed and had faith, why would you be afraid of seeing information to the contrary of what it is that you so adamantly believe by choice?
Very good point. Yeah. Why would there be any objection at all from the elders to have somebody who's, this was a young man who I think he's in his 30s, and he was already an elder in the they don't call it the faith. I think they call it something else. At any rate, but within Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's I'll find the link and send it to you.
Perfect.
Because he might be somebody, if you can track him down, somebody you might want to interview. I mean,
absolutely.
It's a very powerful YouTube.
Absolutely, 100%. So moving towards the thing that people listening to this are most interested in knowing is, why are we so naturally adapted to believe in religion? I know that in your 3rd chapter in your book, you talk about an attachment theory, but I was just curious, like, in a nutshell, I know that there's a whole book about it. I know that it could take hours worth to explain, but if somebody needed an elevator pitch as to why our brains are naturally inclined to believe in religion, what would you say?
That all religious beliefs are byproducts of mechanisms originally designed for other purposes. And reading and writing is a byproduct. We don't have reading and writing adaptations in our brain. we have vision, we have language, we have fine motor movement, and those are biologic adaptations. And they come together to create this powerful cultural byproduct of reading and writing, which has been transformative. Similarly, religious belief is a byproduct of biologic adaptations. I think the crucial one, and I'm going to come back to it in a minute, is the attachment system, and that we are hardwired when we're born that mothers exist, mothers can help, mothers will respond when you are stressed, and that's why every mammal and vertebrate, you just look at the behavior of the infant. You know, they orient towards a mother, they cling on to them, they know that there's food there, they know if they, and know in not the conscious sense, they're
Right.
hardwired that mother will respond when they are distressed. That's prayer. And I think the attachment system is the fundamental one. Then we have our own, we're born with moral systems, moral inferential systems, and they start to come online before we're 1 year of age. There's now fascinating research that shows even a 1-year-old infant is making, in effect, moral decisions, can tell
Wow.
good behavior from bad behavior. Yeah, if anybody's listening to this is interested, look up Kylie Hamlin, Hamlin. She's now at University of British Columbia. She was at Yale. She did some of the research that her first paper was so groundbreaking that it was published in the top science journal, Nature. There's
Wow.
also a very good New York Times Magazine article that came out of it, The Moral Lives of Babies. And so our moral inferential systems come online when we can't even speak. And so, and then religions tell us we wouldn't be moral without them. So they, again, hijack our moral systems. We have things called hyperactive agency detection mechanisms. If you and I right now hear a door slam, we're gonna lurch, and we're going to assume that it's a human agent until proven otherwise. And there's just a myriad adaptations, theory of mind mechanisms. I can think about what questions you may ask me, what may be going on in your mind, even before I meet you. So I can think about a disembodied, complicated mind out there. And that obviously gets hijacked with religion because there's a disembodied person we've never met, God, who knows our thoughts, knows what we're thinking. And so these adaptations that we use in everyday life easily come together to create supernatural beliefs, make us vulnerable to believing them, making us at times, want to share them. And again, it's all sort of everyday things that we use in our social interactions. I mean, religions are basically just fantasized social worlds that use our social adaptations.
So basically, it's having a toolbox that's meant for one
Yeah.
thing, but those exact same tools can
Yeah.
create this other. I remember you mentioned in the book, you were talking about that attachment theory and how the way that we perceive a god or gods is very similar to the way that we perceive the parent. And then you had an interesting chapter, I thought, about how one of the ways we adapted to survive was to be able to kind of perceive how each other feel and how each other think. Like when you get to know somebody really well, they don't have to be in the room for you to be like, they would like this cup. They wouldn't like that decision I made. They would prefer this color. And how it is those ideas that make us put kind of words and thoughts into God. God would want this. God would say this. And that's how I feel like pastors are so what's the word I'm looking for? They're so sure in what they
Yeah.
think God would say and God would believe. So it's interesting. So it's not that these mechanisms were invented to believe in God. God did not
No,
invent these
no.
mechanisms within us. It's tools that we use for survival, for family, and for predicting. I think the example in the book was, like native tribes kind of getting a read on each other. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they here to hurt us? Are they here to help us? Those exact same instincts are what make us susceptible to believe and agree with the idea of an unseen deity.
Yes, no, that's very well said. And again, to me, it's just so interesting. You're a comedian, a performer. I think you probably know of Sacha Baron Cohen, for instance.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, unbelievably funny man. Okay, his first cousin is a man named Simon Baron Cohen, and he's the one who mapped out these theory of mind mechanisms. We're born with the capacity to have a theory about what's going on in another person's mind. Is she angry at me? Is she happy with what I said? What is she going to think about if I do this? And we use it all the time. I mean, what's my boss going to say when I say I screwed up on something? I don't have to have my boss in front of me to think about what she's going to think about. Right. And Sacha Baron Cohen is the one, I'm sorry, Simon Baron Cohen is the one who mapped out these capacities for theory of mind. And defects in theory of mind are what characterize people with Asperger's and autism. People who are on the spectrum are people who have trouble with theory of mind. And surprise, surprise, very few people with Asperger's and autism are religious, because they have difficulty with theory of mind, of knowing what, or being able to think about what other people are thinking.
Interesting.
Oh yeah, it's some of this stuff is so wonderful.
Right.
Simon Baron Cohen has this set of pictures where all you see is black and white photos of eyes. So that's all you see is black and white photos of eyes. And in each of the four corners is an emotion: annoyed, irritable, preoccupied, something else. And these are complicated emotions. It's not angry, sad. It's like desire, concern. And you think, unbelievable, right? How can I? And you can look at those eyes, these grainy black and white pictures of just eyes, and you will be right, 8 out of 10 times.
Wow.
And that's just one mechanism of theory of mind, being able to see what other people might be thinking. Now, of course, women are better at it than men, on average.
Yeah.
On average, but again, he teased out this very specific, complicated capacity that we all have, that we use all the time. Ever since you emailed me, before I met you, talked to you today, I've been thinking about, okay, what might she ask me? What does she think? What might she want her audience to have? So those theory of mind mechanisms are just going on like crazy. And we take that for granted.
Right.
But that's something that religions hijack, because what does God think? What does God want? We're thinking about what God thinks. So all religions are basically these human attributes that are often supercharged, and they're just basic. And we're one of the reasons that we are so successful as a species is that we're ultra social, ultra cooperative. And that goes into that. I mean, we wouldn't be the last surviving hominid unless we were exquisitely adept at relationships, at social relationships. I want to back up, if I can, for just for a minute, because I appreciate that you liked the attachment chapter. There's a neuroscientist out there, John Wathey, Wathey, and he has a book that was published in 2016. I think it's either 2014 or 2016, called The Illusion of God's Presence. And he's about to come out with another book, or I think it actually has been published, The Phantom God.
Wow.
And obviously I like my little book, but I think if somebody's going to read just one book on this, to read The Illusion of God's Presence, because what Jack Wathey did was that I think he sort of got to the core of it, and he makes the case that it's not just our attachment system, but it's our neonatal early infant attachment system that's so important when we're born, and it stays in our brain, doesn't go away. And that's the main piece of the attachment system that religions grab onto. And he said, where does that feeling of the certainty of faith come from? Well, in part, it comes from we're born with just basically the neurologic certainty that mothers exist. Okay. I wrote them down we're also born with the idea that, mothers know how to help. That if we're born with the behaviors to get that out of the mother, that we're born with hard wiring that knows that mothers can help and keep us alive. Okay. That gets used for the sense of gods are omniscient, right? We're born with the hard wiring that, and here know is not conscious. It's just like, I don't have a good term for it, but
right.
We're born with the behaviors that I can't get away from human intentionality,
right.
Which is part of what goes into religion. We're born knowing that that they'll help. Gods are omniscient. That we're born with that they'll nourish us and keep us alive. They're omnipotent. And we're born with the knowledge that if we're distressed, they will respond. That's the origin of prayer. And it's just, I think it's just, if there's any book that's really important that sort of maps out the double helix, the DNA of religion, the core piece of it, I think it's his book. I mean, I think he's put out a hypothesis there, and the evidence. It's like he writes like Darwin. It's one long argument, and he lays out the evidence. He lays out the areas where there's not the evidence. But I think he's put out a hypothesis there and basically said, show me where it's wrong.
Yeah. And I'll find a link to that book and I'll put it in the show notes so that people can.
No, and
buy
he would
it.
be somebody. He's a very.
I'm writing down all these names.
Yeah, I've met him over Zoom. Talked to him on the phone, and he's a modest fellow with nothing to be modest about. And
right.
And as I said, the second book, The Phantom God, he lays out more of the neuroscience behind it.
Wow.
But I think, yeah, it's just. That when I was writing my book, there was the work of Lee Kirkpatrick, who I think is really before Jack, is the one who had mapped out the role of the attachment system in religion. And I think Jack just took it to a deeper and more fundamental level. I just think it's brilliant. And I think, as I said, if you look at all these adaptations that go into religion, I think he sort of struck the mother lode, pardon the pun. But it's just, to me, obviously, it's exciting. I mean, we've got this knowledge. This knowledge is here. It's before us.
Right.
And people have been doing very good work and publishing a lot. And whereas there weren't a lot of books on it, now there are a lot of books, a lot of papers on it. And it hasn't quite seeped into the culture,
the mainstream.
Yeah. I mean, my wish is that the CBS Sunday morning news shows, where they'll interview some people in depth, they'll have an in-depth story on somebody. I just wish they would be, interviewing these people right and left, who are doing this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I appreciate people like my book, but I'm basically just synthesizing and reporting what others have done.
Yeah. And I think that's a great way to put it, synthesizing, because I feel like a lot of the work that you're talking about, you kind of put in one spot in a way that introduces it to somebody so that they're more interested to go find that work elsewhere, as
Yeah.
opposed to, like, at no point in the book does it make it sound like all of it is like your original idea and you're the first
Oh,
one to come up with it. You're very good at crediting.
no, well,
No.
thank you, but that's the truth, because people say, well, what are you researching on religion now? I said, I'm just seeing patients. I'm not, I'm not, I'm not, but there's a lot of work being done. And as I said, I think I'm particularly impressed by John Wathey's. He goes by Jack, but yeah, anybody who's listening to this who wants to dig deep into what I think is the sort of fundamental piece is you can't do any better than the illusion of God's presence.
So what do you think it was then? Because it sounds like humans had the ability to adapt language, they had the ability to write, they had the ability to read, they had the ability to exchange. What do you think it was, given that it sounds like we were given everything we needed to survive on this planet? What do you think it was that made them decide that that wasn't enough and to have to develop what we now know to be religion? Why do you think that is, when we had everything we needed?
Well, because you have to remember, our ancestors had no explanation for lightning, for storms, for the seasons, for they had no explanation for nature. And I think we know that it's useful for you and me to assume human intentionality until proven otherwise. So right now, if I hear a door slam, I'm going to jump, right? And I'm going to act as if there's an intruder until proven otherwise. It takes a while for me to quiet down and realize it was just the breeze blowing through. So we have these what are called hyperactive agency detection mechanisms, and they're very useful for survival because a false if it's let's just go to an everyday thing. Okay. I've got smoke detectors in this house, and they're set on a hair trigger, and you wouldn't want them set any other way.
Right.
They'll go off with boiling water.
Yeah.
Right. And your kitchen gets soaked. But that's a false positive. It's massively inconvenient. It's a real pain. That's a false positive. But if my smoke detector doesn't go off when there's a real fire, that's a false negative, and my house burns down and I may die. So there's this huge asymmetry of risk.
Right.
Cleaning up water on the stove from the smoke detector, spraying water, or death.
Right.
So our agency detective mechanisms are hyperactive, and they assume human agency till proven otherwise, and it helped keep us alive. We also have this thing called promiscuous teleology, which is that we overread purpose. If you ask a kid what stones are for, they're going to say for ducks to scratch their back. We overread purpose. What are lakes for ducks to swim on? And it's very hard for us not to overread purpose. So again, you start combining hyperactive agency detection, promiscuous teleology. Next thing you know, and our moral systems, and next thing you know, lightning is one of the God's way of punishing us for not propitiating him.
Right.
And again, and so we're lucky in that, we now have scientific explanations for the things that our ancestors had no explanation for and had to deal with.
Right. Absolutely.
But again, that's my 2 cents. I mean, people, they're again, and that's one of the interesting things. There are people out there who are thinking about and writing and looking for the evidence in anthropologic records of the things that might have gone into the origins of belief.
Right.
Um,
Right. And I tell people all the time, indigenous religions almost make more sense to me
mhm.
than modern religions. Because to me, it's like, okay, we know for a fact that if the sun doesn't shine and the rain doesn't come down, all the corn will die and we will die. So, what's a good way to get the sun to keep coming out? I don't know, make it happy. Sure. How can we make it happy? I don't know. Maybe we should dance, Like to
Yeah.
me, that makes way more sense than this omniscient and omnipotent person we've never heard that could speak to us if they wanted to, but won't, told me on a stone that, like all these rules about loving your mother. To me, it makes way more sense the
Yeah.
origin of religion as opposed to the current religion. And I also think it's interesting that religion has evolved so much over time, and yet religion is so against the idea of evolution, even though you can see on the timeline in front of you, if you do any digging around in history, that religion has evolved across the world over time. And so it's always been interesting to me that evolution was such a negative point in religion when religions could embrace evolution and claim that, oh, we're actually better now because we have changed and adapted and really learned how to worship God and really heard the message from God. And this is the correct way that we were supposed to have been doing it all along.
Yeah, but I think the problem there is, yes, at one level, I agree with you, but I'm of the view that the reason that religion is hostile to evolution is because at some level they know that it's just fundamentally incompatible.
Right.
That if you embrace evolution, then you have a workable explanation for the origin, the design, and architecture of all life on Earth, from single cell organisms to plants to us. And so, you don't need a divine watchmaker. He's out the window.
Right.
And I think at some level they know that, and that's why they fight tooth and nail to keep it from being taught.
And that's so interesting to me too, because it's almost like it's not almost like, it is like, in order to, as we were speaking about earlier, fear that further information could prove you wrong, it's as though you're admitting
Yeah.
that you're wrong.
Yeah.
And it's just like, wait a second there.
Yeah.
I see what's going on. It's very interesting to me in a
Yeah.
sad but fascinating way.
Yeah, it's both sad and, interesting.
Yeah,
But it
absolutely.
is sad. I mean, and yeah, but I think the other thing that is another thing that is relevant here is I get frustrated because of the tenacious hold religion continues to have. I mean, it's like, when are
Right.
people going to wake up and see
Right.
this stuff and see the light and enjoy the science, and isn't this amazing stuff? And I got frustrated. But then again, I think this is one of Jack's points, is that faith is going to be tenacious because of these early neonatal infantile attachment systems. That
Yeah.
there's a certainty that mothers are out there. There's a certainty that there's a God who will take care of us. And I think he's illuminated some of that. And it makes me,
Yeah.
at moments, ease up on my frustration.
Right. Are you familiar with Aaron Ra? That he's
Uh,
a speaker. He's he's an atheist
oh,
speaker and
yes,
agnostic
yes. R.A.
speaker.
is the last name. Yes, yes. No,
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
I think I've communicated with him in the past. Yes. I
Yeah.
didn't recognize it at first. Yes.
So he and I were speaking about how dangerous it is to be so definitive, and that it's so much easier to trust somebody who admits that they don't know the answer to a good question than to definitively have an answer for everything, to the point where you can pretty much guess that they're probably lying at least about a little bit of it. And I've always thought that it was interesting that the people who I've met who are higher in religious what's the word, status, I suppose, whether it's pastors or priests or whoever, they seem so definitive in their facts and in their thoughts and in their beliefs, when, I don't know, to me, it would be easier to follow them and to believe them if they used the terms "I think," "well, I've always thought," "well, I've researched and come to the conclusion that," etc. I mean, I feel like people who are leaning more towards the atheist, agnostic, the inexistence of God, seem to almost, in a complete opposite end of the spectrum, they seek out other options and other answers to questions that they have, as opposed to the definitive "no, this is always the way." They seem almost delighted by the idea that they could find research that teaches them something new that they didn't know before
Yeah.
and that might change their mind. And it's just, it just seems kind of like a lonely life to think that you already know everything there is to know
Yeah. Yeah.
about
No,
something.
it's just that it is sad. And again, I think that's why I say religion, like I agree with Christopher Hitchens, religion poisons everything, because
Mhm.
it's one of the things that poisons doubt, the importance of doubt, the importance of keeping an open mind, the importance for looking for evidence, for trying to continue to, as they say, carve nature at its joints. And that the thing with Jack Wathey, I think is a great example of that. I think, we had a lot mapped out. That's the basis of my book, all the other stuff that's mapped out. And he takes he opens up another additional avenue that's very important.
Yeah.
And there are going to be others. And it's just science is the slow accumulation of knowledge that is tested, questioned. No idea is above being questioned, uh, you know, and and it's this accumulation. And my frustration, obviously, is I think we've accumulated a fair amount that should be part of education. I think
Right.
you really shouldn't, and, and this is obviously a prejudice, but I think you shouldn't be able to call yourself an educated person in the 21st century without having awareness of these ideas, this
Right.
evidence.
Right.
Now, I've had friends who are believers who've read my book and they still say, "Well, no, I'm still a believer." Okay, but
Right.
at least they've been open to looking at it. But
Right, right. Belief is more belief when you've had the opportunity to disbelieve and have instead made the decision to continue to believe, as
yeah,
opposed to you've never been allowed to expose yourself to other
yes,
ideas. Is that even true belief, right? Like, I'm
yes,
from Arkansas and I have lots of people that I know who have never left Arkansas. They've never been anywhere else. They married the person they met in high school. And I remember, like, I say to my mom all the time, I'm like, "But how do you know for sure that's the one when you've never been anywhere else?" You could like Connecticut so much better than Arkansas, but you're never going to know if you don't go. Now, maybe you move there and you decide you want to get back to Arkansas as fast as possible. That then I would believe so much more that
yeah.
you're happier with your decision.
Yeah, it's
But
based on, well, the thing you illustrate, it's based on evidence.
right,
It's
right,
and evidence and experience. You've gone somewhere else. You've thought about it. You've looked at it.
right,
It's a
absolutely.
different. It's not, it's not cut and dried. Absolute certainty and
Right.
no doubts allowed.
Right, absolutely. Now, in your personal life, was there ever a time where you were religious or where you went to church regularly, or were you pretty much always non-religious?
When you asked me that question, it stirred up some interesting introspection, because I'd always said I was religious. But when I look back, I think I just was going through the motions.
Yes.
I'm not sure I ever really believed, because I was saying, well, did I ever pray? No. I mean, my, and and I think that probably set me up for more easily going to the dark side. Um, but it's an interesting, but it's made me wonder, how many others out there were like me.
Yes.
But I went because it was very social. I mean, religion comes from religare, which means to bond. And I went to Sunday school. I sang in the choir. And I think looking back, it's because choir practice, I could be with my buddies. Um, on Sundays on choir, I could be with my buddies and sit up there and, and not pay attention to the sermon and sort of quietly talk to them.
Yep.
But I'm not sure I ever firmly, truly believed and prayed. I think I just went through the motions. The one thing I was proud of was in my confirmation class, the teacher, who was the assistant minister for education, was talking about predestination. Everything is predestined. And I remember having something along the line of the thought, wait a second. If there's a God and there's predestination,
Yep.
why would a loving God predestine suffering?
Right.
Misery, and it didn't make sense to me. And I was, very proud of the thought. I wasn't smart enough to continue that chain of reasoning a little bit further.
That was a good thought. Anyway.
But, so I sort of, made it through the door into the hallway, but I just, it didn't, quite go far enough. But
right.
So I don't think I was particularly religious. I went through the motions. I think if somebody asked me if I was Christian, I would have said yes, but it was a Presbyterian church. And I think there was also something about the fact that my father would often not go. My mother would go to church. He wouldn't. Later in life, he did some, but he wouldn't go on Sundays. And I think that registered at some level. He, as I said, later in his life, he would go to church and was, be an alderman or something like that. But when I was growing up, my mother would take my sister and me to church, and we would go, and I'd, go. And when I was a little bit older, I'd go early, go to choir, but he didn't go. And I think that may have influenced me in some ways. Like, what's that about? And maybe it was that he promised her not to play golf on Sundays, but he wouldn't go to church. Who knows? But the characterization I love. I remember when I heard it was, Presbyterians, God's frozen people. I've always loved that because I mean, the hymns were all pretty grim.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes.
And I do remember being fascinated by and liking, African American gospel. I mean, because at least, they were happy and dancing.
Right. They're having a good time.
We were, stiff and singing once to every man and nation.
Frozen people. I've never heard that. I love that.
Isn't that good?
That's hilarious.
I love. I just love that. God's frozen people.
Right. I feel bad for anybody listening to this who's never met a Presbyterian, so they don't understand how funny that is.
Yeah, it's just. Whew,
yeah,
it's just perfect. It's just perfect.
Something that you said kind of about your dad and something you said earlier, I just kind of connected. You were talking about how with a lot of people who are religious or choose, I suppose, to believe in a God, the consequences of believing and it being true versus the consequences of believing and the whole thing being false, the weight is so much different. And I feel like I hear a lot of Christians, including myself back in the day when I was religious, say, I'd rather have done all this and find out it was for nothing than to have not done it and get there and find out I should have. Do you think that's why maybe your dad in his later years started going, because he started to realize like, oh, like maybe this is true and I should start going just in case? But
that is a wonderful question. I had never thought of that. I mean, that's actually, sadly, neither are around to be asked that, but no, it's a really, that's a very good question.
Well, because the reason I asked that is because I was talking to somebody, I talk to people about the absence of religion way too much probably. But I was talking to somebody about how even though I am very solid in my disbelief, I have seen the research, I've seen the evidence to feel very comfortable in the idea that there is no God, there is no afterlife, there is no heaven. There is that secret little voice in the back of my brain that says, but I also got saved when I was 9, so I'm good. just in case, just in case I get there and it's all. And so I wonder a lot of times about people like that, because I have noticed that older people tend to kind of pick up the pace in terms of going to church and attending services and becoming more religious. If that is kind of back to that whole, I'd rather just do it, get it over with, check the boxes, find out that it was all for nothing, than get to the end, which they probably feel is nearer than it was, and find out that they should have, and they lost their chance for that ticket kind of to the afterlife.
Yeah, no, I because I think that's incredibly rich. So I think for some people, that's the fear that they get there and they find out that it's true and they've lost their opportunity. Lost their opportunity for what? And it's losing that opportunity to be with their loved ones. I think it goes back to the attachment system.
Right.
One of the things that kept Darwin from publishing was that he knew the pain that it would cause, particularly his wife. Right. His wife was a believer and was very intent on seeing her family in heaven, particularly the children that they had lost. And Darwin struggled with publishing. I mean, he'd figured it out when he was 29 or 30 years old, and he didn't publish it for a long time. And I think your personal view of this is that, okay, I was saved, so I'll be okay. I'll be safe. If it's true, right, I'll be safe. It's okay. I won't be deprived of being with my loved ones. Maybe that's armchair psychiatry, easy hypothesis, but that's what came to my mind. Right. Was that, again, I mean, did you have some sense of, when you go to that place that says, I was saved at 9, so I'll be okay, as to what that okay entails? Yeah. So I grew up Baptist. So we're I'm not anymore. But when I was very religious, there's the belief that there is heaven and there is hell. You go and you see your loved ones, or you burn in a lake of fire. So most of that small, 1/8% worry that sometimes hits you at 3 a.m., comes from the idea that I really don't want to burn in a lake of fire. I don't believe there is one. I don't think there's one. I think, I've been put under anesthesia before. I think when it's over, it's over. There's no, because you had a chapter that I thought was very poignant about how you brought up the question, how would you feel if you were aborted, as like an example of that kind of thought process. People literally cannot wrap their minds around a world in which their consciousness no longer exists. Yes. And so, and I tell people about the time that I was put under anesthesia. It was literally black. There was nothing. There was not a consciousness of unconsciousness. It was gone. And I think people just literally can't wrap their minds around that. They're like, there's no way that I will cease to exist. It just doesn't, that's terrifying. Right. And I wouldn't be surprised at all to find out that that's actually like a biological mechanism that we have created for survival. The idea that we forget we're going to die all the time and we don't think about it. But I think, so growing up, my father passed away when I was very young. He passed away a week after my first birthday. Ooh. And so my whole life, people have always said, your dad's looking down on you. He's so proud of you. You remind us of him every day. He's like cheering. I remember my mom used to say, like, he's cheering with other deceased relatives and other deceased friends. They can't wait to see you. And I tell people, there's this misunderstanding of people who are not religious, of people who identify as atheists or agnostics, that we are cheering the fact that there's no God, that we're so proud. We're like, aha, got you. There is no God. And that's not the case at all. I feel like there's actually a sadness and a mourning period. Absolutely. Because I will never see my dad again. Yeah. I will never see those loved ones again. And so people think that there's this triumphant arrogance to being agnostic or atheist, when in reality, you have to go through this period where you're like,
there is 100% guaranteed to be a time where I will cease to exist and I will never see those people again.
Right.
And when you were talking about Darwin, I know you mentioned that in your book. I wonder if also in order to publish those things, he had to admit to himself, I will never see my children again. I will never see my wife again. I will never see these loved ones again who have passed away. And even though I know that up here, putting it down in writing makes it true, makes it permanent, and it's just tough to face. And so I think that's kind of what that little micro percentage, the same micro percentage that makes me pray for forgiveness when there's turbulence on a plane when I'm like gripping the seat,
Sure.
is that even though you know for a fact, based on research and evidence and what you've seen and what you believe, you truly believe that there is nothing afterward. There's that micro percent that makes you hope that you've made it in case there
Just
is
in case.
just in case. I don't want to burn in hell. So just in case, I got saved and baptized when I was 9. And hopefully, if the Baptist religion is true, if you are saved once, and as long as you ask forgiveness, you're good, then maybe I can still make it in.
Yeah.
In the
No,
nick
I
of time.
think that's again, it's just incredibly rich. I think that would be an interesting question to ask Darwin if we could.
Yeah.
At what point did he know that this was it? And that he wouldn't see his wife and children again. And he lost it. There's a wonderful book called Annie's Box. He lost his 10-year-old daughter to tuberculosis, it was just awful. And it's a superb book written, I think, by a relative. And he knew grief. So that would be an interesting question. At what point did he know that this was it? But I want to go back to what you said, because I think I'd not thought of it, and I think it's a very important point to make, is that yes, this is nothing that we're cheering about,
Right.
because it means again facing the grief.
Mm-hmm.
It means you for all those years, at least you had the hope that you would see the father you never knew and never remembered, and or all you know about him is what other people told you about what other people have communicated, photographs, maybe some home movies or something. So there's this hope that yes, you would be able to know your father and be with him. And so, to give that up means to face grief and loss, that which had been longed for and hoped for. You will never know your father. You will never, right. You'll never have a direct relationship with him, and that's a grief,
right?
And so none of this is, and I think I had, and it goes back to why I think I had it easier, because I don't think I ever really believed. I think I was sort of in this gray area, which so I never had to go through what others have, who were deep believers, and had to go through, just like you were saying, the loss of all that had been tied up for them personally in their religion, the hope to see your father, but then also to suffer the potential loss of family and friends.
Right.
I mean, when you became, if I may ask, when you became a non-believer, what was there tough blowback from family and friends?
So so far my family has never actually asked me about it, and I know that means they also don't listen to my podcast. But I think there would be. I definitely think there would. It goes back to that whole, we can, naturally we can presume the responses of those closest to us. From friends, I actually found that so many of them, especially my generation, actually have always felt the same way, but they thought that they were the only ones that were just going through the motions, that were just reciting the prayer just in case, that thought that they were only going through it on the whole just in case belief. And so I know that from family, there would be tremendous blowback and there would be disappointment and there would be, we didn't raise you this way. It would be taken more as a fault as a parent or as a relative that this happened to me or that I became this thing. But I found that my generation, and I think a lot of generations, if they were honest with themselves, we've all secretly not necessarily believed, but done it because we were told to. And we're just waiting for somebody to be the first one to ask the right question or to give us permission to leave. And so I think and I feel the same way about politics. I feel like a lot of super duper liberal or super duper conservative individuals, when you get them alone in a room and you ask them the right questions, like, come on, man, you don't actually believe, they would be more willing to be like, I don't, but most of my loved ones do. And I feel like that's the right decision to make. And so I do think there would be blowback, but I wonder how much of that blowback would be jealousy that I am free and that I feel like I can do and say and think whatever I want and there's no punishment, versus people who would love to be able to do that, but they can never justify that in their mind because they are so afraid of the alternate, which is getting to heaven and realizing they could have made it if they had tried, or if they'd been more devout, or if they prayed more. So I think the blowback would be swift and fierce, but I think it would come less from, oh my gosh, I can't believe you don't believe in God, and more from, I have always secretly felt that way, but I can't say so out loud, and I'm a little bit jealous that you feel like you can. And I am angry. I don't know if you've noticed a lot of people who block good laws and good change from happening. Their answer is always, well, I had to pay my student loans. Well, I had to do this. It's never, my way is for the benefit of everyone. It's my way is because I had to suffer, so you should too.
Yeah.
And I think that would be where the blowback comes from. Well, I had to go to church every Sunday. I had to pray. I had to this. I had to abstain from all of these things that are deemed, wrong in the eyes of the Lord. So how dare you think that you don't also have to abstain from those things and you're on the same level as me, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, but one to go a little bit further, because this really, I think, is important, because I think it's important for us to find out.
Yeah.
Do you have some sense of why you and your peers, became unbelievers, without,
I do.
this knowledge? Because I think that's really crucial, because if we know if we know what is helping push people away from it, I think that's important information.
Honestly,
it's not my book.
Yeah,
It's not that knowledge. People are moving on their own.
Yeah, I truly believe that the reason that my generation, and maybe the generation like right before me and right after me, are so open about being agnostic and atheist and non-religious is because we are also open about mental health. And we, I think, at a younger age, pursue things like therapy, and we have we are depressed and we figure out why, as opposed to buckling down, bootstrapping it. I feel like a lot of generations, especially my parents' generation and older, that was a sign of weakness. If you had a therapist, you did not put that stuff on Facebook. You didn't joke about it. You didn't talk about it. And I feel like my generation is the first generation that's like, hey, mental illness is actually quite common, or depression is quite common, or I wonder why I'm sad all the time, or maybe my dad leaving is part of the reason why I have issues with boyfriends, or something like that. And so I think that we're just more open to the conversation, and we're more open to the social norm of pursuing those questions and those ideas and sharing with our peers. My friends joke all the time about, oh, my therapist said this, my therapist said that. And generations before us, that would have been horrifying. Like, you don't tell somebody that your neighbor's wife sees a therapist, she's crazy, right? Like, that means there's something wrong with her. And so I think that exact same openness makes us be like, do you actually believe this stuff? No. No, I'm not going to go back once I turn 18 to church. Yeah, me neither. I'm going to do something else. Instead of making it like a grandstand, we just accept that it's just not a belief. We're used to doing research and things like that.
But it sounds like you think part of it is also that there's an openness to looking at psychological motivation, or looking at it's just a broader, looking at one's own mind, looking at
Yes.
one's own internal struggles, or
Yeah.
just, and so it makes you open to, like you said, question things, and one of them would be question belief.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily my generation having an attack on religion. I
Right.
think we're having an attack on keeping secrets and not exploring mental health and ideas and questions. I'm going to be honest. My biggest push towards becoming agnostic was I started taking psychedelics. And the questions that I already had up here, I was about 25, and I already was like, that doesn't make sense. Like, why would God let things like the Holocaust happen and babies die and people I love get cancer? Like, because I remember one of the questions, one of the things that used to drive me crazy is when I would tell people that my dad died, they would say either, God has a reason and a purpose for everything, or they would say, God uses tough situations to teach us a lesson. But nobody could ever tell me what that lesson was that my family needed so badly to learn, when my mom had been a devout Christian her whole life. She prays every day, she goes to church, she's one of the most devout Christians you'll meet. And I'm like, what lesson was it that she needed to learn so harshly? And those questions that I already had, once introduced to these psychedelics, my brain, it almost, I tell people, it almost felt like a part of my brain that had been shut down opened for the first time in my entire life that day. And when you say, for example, smoke weed and you write down questions, the next day you're like, these are the dumbest questions I've ever heard in my whole life. But when I wrote down those questions after trying psychedelic mushrooms, the next day they were still really good
Good
questions.
questions.
And I tell people all the time, that day before I took those mushrooms, I was a conservative Republican and I was a Christian. And when I woke up the next day, I was a liberal atheist Democrat, because all of the questions about all of those beliefs that I thought I had, which it turns out were just social behaviors that I was doing because everybody else around me was doing them and it was acceptable, weren't actually at all what I believed deep in my brain.
I'm curious, do you remember what some of the questions were that you wrote down?
Yeah. So one of the big ones was, if God is omnipotent and omniscient, if he knows for a fact I'm going to sin and he still lets me do it, and then he sends me to hell because I did what he already knew I was going to do and didn't stop me from doing, how does that make sense? A lot of the questions evolved from, why is it that certain parts of the Bible we're told are metaphor, but the metaphors in the Bible we are told are how it is? For example, the Bible very plainly states, stone a woman to death who's unmarried but not a virgin. But it was different back then. It was different back then. That's almost a metaphor, right? But when the Bible says, like, don't wear mixed fabrics, don't eat pork, very clearly, no, that's metaphor, that's metaphor. But when the Bible metaphorically talks about gays, very metaphorically, no, that's permanent. God hates gays. Gay is a sin. That's permanent. Even though the very clearly stated rules are metaphor, and the very ambiguous lessons that people pick and choose to believe are concrete. And the Bible says women should not preach. Women should sit at the feet of their husbands, and their mouth is not for preaching. It is for doing what their husband says and supporting him, leading your family in the word. And yet I was taught so many biblical lessons by women. And I remember in church, I raised my hand when I was in the college group and I said, I don't really understand the difference between what you're doing right now and preaching. And I wasn't trying to be sassy or anything. I legitimately wanted to know, what is the difference between what you're doing for us right now and preaching? And she couldn't answer the question. And so it's those sorts of questions that just didn't make any sense. They didn't make any sense at all. And whenever I would ask people to answer those questions, they either wouldn't have an answer and I would get punished, as opposed to told, like, that's a great question. Or I was told some very definitive, concrete answer that I knew nobody could really know that definitively. I'd been in debate for years. So I knew that nobody could know the answer to the question I'd asked very definitively, very concretely. There's no way that this guy in, teaching middle school church classes in Chicago, Illinois, had all the answers to life's mysteries. And so it was those sorts of questions that they were there, but
So
put them
they
away.
were already, they were sort of, you were close.
Right.
They were close, and this just sort of opened the door to
Right.
the full articulation of them.
Right. I was one of those people where I feel like there's two kinds of people. There's people where when you ask them a question, they say, wow, that's a really good question. I don't actually know. Let's find out together. And there's other people where you ask them a question and they get insulted by you insinuating they don't know. And they instead respond with an attack to you. So you're like, hey, why did you vote for this person? Well, why did you vote for the person who this? Don't answer the question. You know, hey, why does this not make sense about the Bible? Well, why does this make sense about being an atheist? You know, and so I was one of those people. But when I really sat and analyzed, why do I believe? Why is this the correct way for me? Why does this make sense? It didn't make sense. I didn't believe it. Everything that I had in response to those questions were, well, my pastor told me, well, I heard that, well, and no definitive. And as somebody who was in debate for so long, I could not justify one part of my life being all about research. And if you don't find the research to support your argument, it's not the correct argument. You're wrong. And yet this other side of my life and my brain was, belief is not having to have research in order to know something's true. And so it just didn't mesh. Yeah.
And your sense is that your friends, it's been a similar sort of process.
Yes. Minus the shrooms. I don't know as many people who take it.
It's just an internal focus.
Either
the openness
Right.
to looking at mental health,
Right.
and the openness to an internal questioning of
Yes.
of one's life, one's beliefs, who one is,
the moment they were no longer under their parents' roof, they didn't go to church, they didn't pray, they didn't worship, they weren't opposed to it, they just were ambivalent to it. It did not matter anymore, and they just stopped.
To their lives.
Right. And so then when you ask them, like, are you religious, they'll first say, yeah, I'm a Christian, and then you're like, really? They're like,
yeah,
I mean, I am, because my mom will be mad if I'm not. You know, like,
well,
like,
no,
yeah.
If you know, the reality is, I didn't publish my book, and none of my talks occurred until after my parents were deceased.
Yeah.
Would I, if they had lived longer, would I have,
what would they think? Yeah.
And would I have done it? Would I have, would I have posted? I don't know. But they, when this happened, they were, because,
do you think that had any part of it? Do you think that had, even in like the back recesses of your mind, that had any part with why you waited until that point to kind of come out guns blazing a little bit?
I don't think so. Because they were, I'd have to double check the dates, but I think my mother died, and I think it was like 2002, 2001, and then my father had Alzheimer's, and so he was functionally gone. He died 4 years later, but he was functionally gone pretty much by the time my mother died. That's a good question. I actually need to double check the dates.
Yeah.
My sense is that, no, when all this started to crystallize, and that really the first thing that crystallized was the formulation, a potential formulation for the motivations for suicide terrorism.
Yeah.
I think they were already deceased, or
Wow.
my mother was deceased and my father was functionally not there.
And then since the publication of your book, have you experienced any blowback from people you were close to, or any kind of like, oh, I'm disappointed that you feel that way, or anything like that? Any ramifications?
I would probably have to ask my wife her opinion on that question too, because I think I may have been blind to some of it. At presentations, I would get hostile questions,
for sure,
because I would give presentations. I gave a presentation on the suicide terrorism at I think a medical center hour or something like that, and I got a very angry blowback. But it's like most of the time my presentations have been preaching to the converted. It's,
Yeah.
they're already there, and I'm just giving them more information.
Yeah.
In terms of close relationships, I think, because I'm like you, I'm in the Bible Belt, and I think my friends just say, well, that's Andy, and it just doesn't get talked about. I did make a point of sending a copy of my book to all my friends, including the ones who were, very religious, but I just think that they just think that, well, that's
Oh,
Andy.
his antics.
That's Andy. But I want to go back, if I may, just
Oh,
to
yeah.
something you said that I think is worth putting a red flag on. When you were talking about somebody who said to you something about how would you feel if you were a fetus, there was something you said.
Yeah. So that the idea that people can't fathom an existence in which their thoughts and their consciousness
There's
doesn't
no
exist.
consciousness.
Right. And
Yeah.
there's that argument where people say, how would you feel if you were aborted? Or how
Right.
would you feel if you didn't make it to heaven? And you're like, I wouldn't. I would not. I would not.
Because I wanted to red flag that, because what you're illustrating is one of the things that makes us vulnerable to religious belief, is that,
Right.
We can't imagine a person without an active mind. And so a fetus is a person, is already a whole person. And if it's a whole person, they've got thoughts and feelings. And so it's very easy for us to, project into a fetus an adult mind, because again, these theory of mind mechanisms, just they basically never turn off.
Right.
I mean, it takes me 2 seconds to start talking to my mother in my head, and and that's because, even though part of me knows that she's dead, and that, that still my theory of mind mechanisms for my mother, they never turn off.
Right.
I can, what would she be thinking? Okay, wait a second, she's not.
Yeah. Do you think that's evolutionary?
Oh yeah, no, but again, it's a, sure. I mean, we are a successful species because we don't have to have a person's body in front of us to be able to think about their mind, and to think about what they're thinking about what I'm thinking. And there's a neuroscientist who sort of figured this out. And if I may, it's an interesting demonstration here. If we take this as I've got an apple here, and we'll just assume that this is a brain, okay? And so there's half a brain, and let's say this is the front of the brain, so I'm looking out that way. That's the front of the brain, that's the back of the brain. So we think about and process our own thoughts and feelings along the midline, middle of the frontal cortex. That's where I'm thinking about my thoughts. That's where I also process what you're thinking, and what I think you're thinking, what you're thinking, what I'm thinking. That's all midline. Okay. Now, I perceive my right hand actually on the cortex, on the outside of the brain. That's where I'm perceiving my hand. All the motor and sensory strips are on the cortex. Similarly, if I look at your left hand, which is up over your mouth right now, I perceive that in, cortex, orbital cortex, the eyes, but also, whoop.
Oh no, it's gone.
I dropped my brain.
Yeah.
So what this is that our default setting of the human, our default setting is that minds are separate from bodies.
Yes.
And they're not. The mind is what the brain does, but it evolved so that we think about other people's brains and minds without having to see them in front of us.
Right.
So I can think about what, right now, I can think about what my wife may be thinking right now, or what she wants to do this evening, and I don't have to have her standing right here. I can think about that.
Yeah.
I can think about, and I usually think, what my boss is going to think or do next week. And so you can see that it's just one little step to thinking about what an ancestor is thinking, what an authority is thinking. Let's say, for instance, Obama was still president. We could only wish. But let's just imagine for a moment that Obama was still president. You and I can instantly think of a conversation we would like to have with Obama.
Right.
We can think about what we would like to ask him. We would like to think, we can easily think about, President Obama, could you possibly do this or do that, or are you aware of this? And what is that? It's thinking about, it's having a complicated conversation with an unseen other in a position of authority, right?
Yep. Right.
So, and we do that all the time.
Right.
Anybody who's employed is thinking about what the higher ups are thinking.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
At some point in the week, how's this going to float with upstairs?
Right.
It's just one small step to thinking about an authority figure in the sky.
Right. That you've never seen and isn't there.
Never seen. Right. And okay, good point. Okay. So I'm working for people at a distance. I mean, the governor is actually technically my boss, but he's somebody I've never seen or met. But I can wonder about what he's thinking. Right now, you and I can wonder about what his next move is going to be, and we don't know him. We've never seen him. We've never directly interacted with him, but we can have a complicated interaction in our mind with a very powerful authority figure who has impact on us.
Yeah, and he makes the rules.
And he makes the rules, right? But the point of this is that, and again, one of the things that excited me is that even as crazy as some religions are, it's just one small step from everyday, ordinary psychological mechanisms we use all the time, that we depend on, and that are crucial for our survival, and for, it's a byproduct of our being this ultra cooperative, ultra social species.
Right. And this idea that, like, I remember when I was young and very religious, the idea of talking to God was widely accepted. The idea of being in a place and asking him questions and just knowing that you'll feel the answer, or he'll answer you in some way, was perfectly acceptable. But if my parents had walked in to me talking to myself in the corner, addressing only me, for some reason, that's a red flag, and that's, crazy. But if you're speaking to this unseen force who nobody has ever seen, nobody has ever heard, supposedly people who have been dead for 2,000 years spoke to him, but for whatever reason in between now and then he stopped talking to us directly, and we know it's a he for whatever reason.
They never gave us the password.
Right. Yeah, they never gave us that secret password that we could have been saying this whole time. But yeah, I think it's super duper interesting. This whole
it's one small step. But the other thing that we don't question, and again, I never thought of this when I was a kid, but and it would be interesting to ask your mother, well, wait a second, if God knows what I'm thinking, right? If God knows what I'm thinking, why do I have to pray to him? Why do I have to speak to him?
Yes.
Okay. And again, it's because we usually speak to other people. Again, it's human attribute, but it's like, wait a second, if he knows what I'm thinking, why do I have to pray to him and talk to him?
Right. Because he's waiting for you to come to him and ask. He knows what you need. He knows your desires. But until you come to him and personally ask, there's nothing he can do about it, even though supposedly there's everything he can do about it.
Right. He's omnipotent. And but again, and again, and one of the other mechanisms is submission to authority.
Yeah.
and
yes.
asking for help from an authority figure.
Right. And I do think that a lot of religions are coming from a place that they think is good. But I also think for that reason, the submission to authority, we find that a lot of religions know exactly what they're doing. And they do, we learn about these cults that get disassembled by, the police or whatever every once in a while. You find out about these crazy cults out in the middle of Texas or whatever that lived in compounds, and the man was the husband of like 100 women and they weren't allowed to leave. I think those cults know exactly what they're doing in terms of making people submissive, while other religions, the same religions who would be like, we're not like them, they're crazy, follow the exact same rules but in a different way. So therefore we're not them. They're the crazy ones.
They have deniability.
Right. Man,
Yeah.
Fascinating. This is
No, it is. It's just. That's the thing is, it's just. I mean, it's interesting stuff, and it doesn't require it doesn't require anything but awareness of one's own familiar everyday mechanisms.
Right. And honestly, I feel like there's actually I don't know if this is everybody's experience, but in my experience, I find a tremendous sense of relief when I think that none of it is real and that nobody's sitting up there waiting for me to make the right decision, basically being like, oh, okay, good. She did the right thing. Oh, is she going to make it? Is she like, once I realize that the video game doesn't exist, there's this sense of relief that I am a simple, small drop in a vast universe and I don't matter. And I know that's weird. You think the last thing on earth you'd want is to not matter. But when you think that your mattering determines whether or not you burn for eternity or make it through the gates, I would rather not matter. Thank you.
Yeah. And you're brought up with, look at those terrible alternatives. Endless pain and suffering, being able to be with loved ones.
Right. Or like that's it. Those are the only two. If people are going to stand here and argue that we need 4 political parties, I feel like there's an argument that we deserve at least 4 options for where we go when this is all over, right? At least some people have purgatory, which seems to be in between, but.
And I haven't kept up with it, but hasn't the Catholic Church sort of gotten rid of purgatory? Or children are no longer in purgatory, something like that?
Like unbaptized babies, I don't think go to purgatory anymore.
Oh, okay.
Because it used to be
I knew there was something. I knew there was some edict that changed some of the admissions criteria.
Right, which to me is like, because it doesn't make sense, right? That a baby who hasn't had a chance to even be alive on this planet is deemed like a sinner unworthy of heaven. It doesn't make sense. And also and I think also, even when I was very religious, I remember when I finally, ironically, read the Bible, I remember thinking that even if this guy is real, even if this is the God, this is not a guy I want to serve. This guy's awful. He's horrible and he's evil and he's violent and he doesn't like any of us, yet he keeps making us. Like, what is that about? I remember thinking like, this is like this is like the movie Saw, where that voice is like, do what I say, or you're, going to be torn to pieces or whatever. And I feel like that's a lot of people's first step in the direction of disbelief is, okay, great. He is real. He's awful. Can we admit that at least,
Yeah, there's a wonderful, Richard Dawkins has a wonderful line about, I think it's in The God Delusion, about, God being this angry, old, sully, awful, irritable, angry, spiteful man. I mean, and I can't do it justice, but it's this wonderful description, which absolutely rings true.
Yep. Some of the people I know who are the most atheistic, I suppose is the word, or the least religious, are people who have actually read the Bible. And some of the most devout Christians I know who would lay their life on the line for the word of the gospel haven't actually read a lot of the Bible. And you're just like, It goes back to that whole, are you not reading it because maybe you're afraid of what's in there? Maybe you're afraid of what you'll read?
Yeah.
Plausible deniability. If I don't know it's against the law to eat pork, I could just keep eating pork and not know that was a sin.
Yeah. No, and there's somebody else who said something when one of the first steps towards becoming an atheist is to read the King James Bible or something.
Yeah.
You just actually read it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And to really hold yourself accountable in terms of the answer to those questions. Because if you read the Bible, and people who say I'm a devout Christian, or people who say I am evangelical, or I am fundamentalist, at least what I'll give the fundamentalists, what I'll give them is they even agree that the horrible stuff is horrible, but they still believe it. At least the fundamentalists are like, yeah, that's really terrible, but those are the rules, so
Yeah.
here we are. But it's very interesting that there's these terrible, horrible rules, and people who want to say that they are the most devout Christians don't also want to say that they agree with those things. But like, in order to say you're one, doesn't that mean that you have to believe what they say you believe? I don't know. It's just,
Yeah, no, I agree with it. I mean, you can say at least the fundamentalists are honest.
right. At least they're on, like the Calvinists, some of the
Yeah.
scariest people I've ever met in my whole life, but at least they stick to it. You say, so God knew the Holocaust was going to happen. Yep. And he let it happen. Yep. It's like, oof.
Yeah.
But, well, I know that I've kept you 40 minutes past what I said I was going to do.
It's fine.
Yeah, I appreciate your time.
No, this is
and
no, I was just gonna say one of the other things I never I never had a chance to ask him, but my father was with the troops that liberated Buchenwald, and so he saw firsthand the Holocaust.
Right.
And he was a signalman, and so he had a camera, and he took pictures.
Oh man.
And but he he talked about it once when I was doing an exchange program at Duke in Germany, and that's the first time I knew that and Buchenwald was a place where the commandant's wife, had the skin lamps and all that awful stuff.
Oh my gosh.
And we found, after he died, his pictures. And
that was going to be my question, is if you'd seen
letters to my mother about it. And so again, it didn't occur to me until way too late to say, look, you wouldn't go to church. And I wondered if the Holocaust, not the Holocaust, but I wonder if what you witnessed in World War II, he was a combat veteran in World War II. And, I wish I'd had the opportunity to ask him,
maybe
well, first of all, how did it affect you? I mean,
right.
How did it affect you? And did it have anything to do with, you never went to church when we were growing up? So
right.
And that was in the years. I'm old. I mean, I was born in 48, and so it was still within early years after his experiences.
Yeah,
so
very soon after.
Yeah, never had a chance to ask him. But
wow.
When you mentioned the Holocaust, I made that that reminded me of that.
Yeah, and so it makes you wonder if he ever allowed himself to kind of draw that connection. Like, this is supposedly the God that takes care of everybody, and this is also the God that knew all of that was going to happen. That's a great question. But and it also kind of goes back to that generation. I feel like is one of the generations that were also not discouraged, because I don't think people talked about it ever, but they didn't really talk about mental assistance for those people who saw those things and took pictures of those things. And it just makes you wonder how different the world would be if all of those people came back and got counseling or got to see a therapist, even for
we're able to talk about it. Because I think I think most of them are like my dad. They just came back. They went to work. And I thought it was interesting. I mean, he never participated in American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars. If you met him and talked to him, you would never know.
Wow.
And so I think that generation just came back, and there are reports, we do know that a lot of those veterans, particularly ones who were prisoners of war, suffered terribly, but rarely got help.
Right. And I remember when I was in English in high school, we talked about a book by Kurt Vonnegut, the one with the time traveler. I totally spaced on the name. He wrote a book about a time traveling optometrist. And the very last chapter of this book talks about Kurt Vonnegut's experience cleaning up the bombing of Dresden. I guess he was there, like, cleaning the basements and the people that died in Dresden. And we learned about how it was so complicated for him to talk about, and it was so hard for him to talk about. He ended up writing this entire book about a time traveling optometrist who meets these aliens and does these wild things in order to finally be able to talk about what he saw and what he experienced. And how, like, that's what it took for him to process that. And it just makes you wonder, especially with people like your dad, like, what did it take for him to process? Just locking it away? Was that better for him? Just pretending it never happened, not talking about it, not celebrating it? It's such a curious thing, the way that each person processes things so differently,
or doesn't
or
process
doesn't, right? Or
Yeah. I
does
mean,
not ever process it.
yeah. I mean, Kurt Vonnegut at least ultimately attempted to do it.
Right. And it makes you wonder how successful that was, that
Well, but I think
approach.
but I think, don't you think there's at least a greater probability
Oh yeah,
that it was helpful to him than just
that it was
locking it,
therapeutic.
that
Right.
it was locking, you know. I mean, there's always a concern that it'll re-traumatize people, but I think at some point when people are ready, it's better to talk about it.
Absolutely. And do you find that in your profession?
Oh yeah.
That,
Well, and
yeah.
that's obviously the bias of my profession.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think, that, carrying that kind of thing around is, you're not going to be the idea that you can stuff it in the back closet and it's not going to affect you. I think that's rare.
And I think some people, if you got a glimpse into that closet, it would look a lot like those hoarder houses that we see on television that are just stacked to the brim and stuffed as full as possible.
Yeah,
But
and those and the closet that my father would have would be a closet stuffed with, emaciated dead people.
right. I can only imagine what
Yeah.
kind of,
Well, it was interesting. I mean, he actually said that the one time he talked about it, he said what affected him most was not all the corpses they found, which was awful, but the people who were still alive, and they nursed them and they still died. And
wow.
and the reason was that they, we now know, and it wasn't until medical school when I heard this and I thought, oh, that's what happened to my dad. When you have somebody who's been starving, you can't give them too much too fast or it kills them.
No, right.
And that's, we didn't know that, and so they're frantically trying to give these people all this stuff, and it actually ends up killing them.
Yeah.
And he didn't know that, and he said it was just awful. They still found a lot of people alive, and they were nursing them, and a lot of them died. He said that was actually the worst part of it,
Right.
because you're actually giving people stuff, trying to feed them, and they die.
Right. And they've made it that far. They made
They
it
made it
to,
that
they
far.
made it past the finish line. They,
Right.
it's like when you hear the ambulance is here, and you don't
Yeah.
realize that there's still an inherent danger in the saving
Yeah.
you from what you
And if
think.
they felt, and I think my hypothesis, and again, it's got to be a hypothesis, is that he felt, okay, did we do something wrong? In other words,
Yeah.
what was I an agent in their death
Right. Right.
when I'm trying to save
Absolutely.
them?
Right. Because he didn't have anything to do with the people he came upon that were already deceased. But did he, in his mind, have something to do with the people that survived until he showed up and tried to help them, and maybe
Yeah.
didn't help them the way, yeah.
Something.
My mom has talked about how she has given 2 different people CPR, and both of those people died. And while they died of a heart attack, they both had a heart attack, and she was told that both of them were probably dead the moment they hit the floor. It's a similar thing. It's like, would they have been better off if somebody else had done CPR on them, or were they already gone? Were they already that idea? And I think that is why other generations like really value taking care of their mentality and their mental health and their brain, because they see the generations before them packing it away, those people saying, and I turned out fine. And you're like,
no,
you turned out nice, but did you turn out fine? Like, what's the definition of fine?
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. You turned out nice, but you can't sleep at night. On the weekends, you drink too much.
Right. You were totally absent as a parent for some of these people, right? Like, you got divorced from your spouse, and you married 6 times. Like, is that fine? I don't know. I'm not sure. But well, if you could leave people listening to this with any word or idea or recommendation or thought that they can pursue after having listened to this episode, what would your message be to anybody listening? Let's do it.
I think it would be to, read the books. If you're interested in this, there are numerous books. Read the books about why we believe. Go on the internet. If you don't have time to read, they're wonderful lectures. I think reading Dawkins, The God Delusion, reading Christopher Hitchens, God, how religion poisons everything, but that's not the exact title. But Hitchens' book, there's just a lot of really good introductions to these set of ideas that I think, obviously we don't have the complete story, but we now are we really are close to a comprehensive cognitive neuroscience, a comprehensive psychology of religious belief. And I feel that, there are really, 3 questions, before us, which are, what am I going to do with this knowledge? Right. And what are you going to do with this knowledge? But most importantly is, what are we as a scientifically literate democratic society in the 21st century? What are we going to do with this knowledge, for future generations?
That's a great question. And I feel like we're still trying to figure that one out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No.
And I think we're headed in the right direction.
No, I think
But
we're headed in the right direction. It's just, that's a little slower than I'd like, but maybe that's my not being realistic about human nature.
Right. It's like, this would have been great if it had happened several hundred years ago, but
Yes.
it didn't. So we got to deal with what
right.
well,
and I like the line, science progresses one funeral at a time.
It literally does, though. And one of my favorite things about science is finding out how many correct, intelligent, groundbreaking people were murdered for being correct and intelligent and right about things. It's pretty sad. You find out they died in horrible ways for being like, hey, maybe this isn't real. And everybody's like, burn them, throw them off the cliff.
Right. And at least we don't, and that's progress. We don't have to,
Right.
I mean, none of these people, none of these people are, I think at risk.
Right.
Which they, as you're right, they would have been in the 16th, 17th, 18th century.
Yeah, you'd be a heretic.
Oh,
sir.
Yes.
Yeah. But instead, you just get
just a shrink working in a student health service.
You just get to get on Zoom and talk about it.
Yeah.
But well, thank you so much for your time. I have
listen,
loved this conversation.
Look, I've said, I thank you. Thank you for reaching out. Thanks for the opportunity. I welcome the chance to get this stuff out there, because I think it's important. I think it's interesting. I think it's accessible to anybody with curiosity.
Right.
You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to know. I mean, it's just it's the mechanisms you use every day to negotiate your life.
You don't have to, if you don't want to, become a neurosurgeon or anything like that, to wonder what's going on with your own brain and your own beliefs and your own thoughts. Yeah, right. Absolutely.
And what makes us all vulnerable to supernatural beliefs.
Right. Absolutely. And I'm going to send you like 1,000 more questions. So
sure.
You're always invited to come back on and talk about those questions if you
sure.
feel so inclined.
Anytime. I'd be delighted. And again, I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity.
Of course. Literally anytime. Like,
okay.
I remember you said, you were like, be careful saying that. You're like, because I will send you things. but I will, if you don't mind, I'll link your discussion in the show notes. I'll link your book in the show notes. I wrote down every book that you recommended, and when I
Good.
find links to those, I'll put those in the show notes. And then I'd love to have you back in the future. But I hope you have a great rest of your
Anytime.
week. Yeah,
Anytime.
yeah,
And thank you again. It's very nice to meet you, and thank you so much.
of course. Nice to meet you as
And
well.
yeah, good luck. Good luck with the next stand-up.
Thanks.
No,
Thanks.
I'm a huge fan of stand-up.
Yeah,
So
I had
I
one.
love stand-up.
I had one last night that I forgot to clarify it was inside or outside, and it was freezing. It was so cold. It was outside on a rooftop, and it was so that's that's a whole thing. But well, yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I will email you more questions, and I will see
Certainly.
you again soon, hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Talk to you later.